Unit 3 of the AP Environmental Science curriculum focuses on populations. And so in this unit, we'll talk about human populations and the factors that govern population. We'll talk about how populations of people go through stages, predictable stages of development as economies develop. We'll talk also about demographics and age structure diagrams and things of those sorts. So we're going to start here with just a pretty basic understanding of this concept of generalist versus specialist species. And we've talked about this a little bit in prior units, but when we think about a generalist, we're talking about a species that has a very wide, a very broad fundamental niche. And so if you remember what that means, the niche is sort of the role an organism plays, all the factors that it requires in terms of abiotic conditions, energy supply, habitat, etc. So a generalist species can use a very wide variety of habitat conditions, foods, can consume a variety of foods, has a wide range of abiotic conditions in which it can be successful, and so it can lead to these species being able to exist in a large variety of habitats. If you look at these three species shown here, and you look at the range in North America, all three of them are very widely distributed. That raccoons are omnivores which can eat a huge variety of foods. They can tolerate all sorts of conditions. They can tolerate being in close proximity to human development as well. Same thing with the coyote and with the white-tailed deer that we see here. These are generalist species. At the other end of the spectrum, we have specialist species. Specialist species have a relatively narrow fundamental niche. They may depend on very specific foods. They may depend on a very specific type of habitat. And so these specialist species often are not tolerant of a wide range of conditions, that they can only survive and be successful in a relatively narrow range of conditions. Some examples of these, and we can see again, they're more limited, much more limited distribution, their range in different places. The koala, which depends on eucalyptus as its food source, has a very narrow range in Australia. The giant panda, which consumes bamboo solely, has a very, very narrow and limited range in Asia. And then we have the Canadian lynx here that you see eating a rabbit, which is confined to sort of the northern latitudes of North America. So these are specialist species. And when we think about these generalist and specialist species, we can consider their vulnerability to disturbance or vulnerability to invasives. Invasive species, we'll talk more extensively about later on in the course, but invasive species are species which are moved from one part of the world to another and are able to establish populations that have negative impacts on native species in their new habitats. And oftentimes what we find are that these invasive species are generalists. They can thrive in a variety of conditions. They can eat a wide variety of foods. They can tolerate large abiotic fluctuations. Some examples, and we may end up watching an interesting movie about cane toads. This is a cane toad, which are rampant in Australia. Millions and millions, maybe billions of cane toads have been established there after a small number were actually purposely introduced to Australia. Or rats, which came from Europe to North America, but have since obviously spread throughout the world. These are generalist species that have become invasive. And those generalists can often endanger specialist species because the specialist species have very narrow range in which they can exist, or narrow food preferences and habitat preferences. If generalist invasive species enter their habitat, they can outcompete often these species that have much narrower range, these specialist species. And we know that these endangered species also are under threat not only from invasives, but also due to human induced issues such as habitat reduction. As human development increases, as agricultural space that humans require increases, it can infringe upon the habitats that these other species require. And so human activities climate change, etc., can serve to further endanger these species that are at very low or limited numbers. And so these endangered species often must be protected from these different impacts that humans have on them.